Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso, and I'm here with Bhante Jayasara, and we're here for another Sangha panel discussion. And so we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll introduce the topic, and we'll have some conversation about it. And of course, at any time, you're welcome to type in questions related to the topic, and we'll answer them. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So the topic for the Sangha panel today is entitled Eat Like a Monk, and the focus is
The focus is.
Well, apparently it's a good title given the response that we got, or at least an interesting title. Anyway, so the idea is to focus on talking about the various practices that we have in Buddhist monastic life related to food. So food and medicines and the things that we ingest. And the relationship that we have in Buddhism in general. So whether one is a monastic or a lay person, the relationship with consumables, with edibles, medicinals, and how we can develop a more wholesome relationship with what we consume. And again, with a particular focus on the monastic rules and practices, which are related to consumption of foods and medicines and so on. And why these practices are supportive towards awakening, how they can be used in a way which is beneficial to the training of the mind. So perhaps I'll start with just a broad overview of the topic, and then we can start going to a bit more detail from there. So first off, acknowledging that food is one thing that we quite literally can't live without. So without eating anything, your body will live for maybe a few weeks, during which time it will become progressively weaker and then eventually die, usually within a month or two. And with water, of course, it's much quicker. If you don't consume any water, then usually you'll die within a week, usually 3 to 7 days, rarely longer. There are cases of people lasting more than a week without water, but it's not common. So food and drink, these are necessities for our daily life. And in the case of significant health problems, medicines can also be helpful or necessary. But the Buddha was also quite realistic in acknowledging that we tend to have very strong desires and attachments related to food, very strong preferences, very strong opinions, very strong ideas about the right way and the wrong way to have food in our lives, right way and the wrong way to prepare and consume things. And also this deep emotional reactivity that we tend to have whenever the topic of food comes up. And particularly when dealing with scarcity or with not getting exactly what we want or what we think we need. I remember seeing many years ago when I was living in a Zen monastery, I remember seeing this like red hot shouting match over protein powder. And I wasn't interested in protein powder. I'm still not particularly interested in protein powder. So to me, it seemed very silly, but to the people involved in the argument, it was deadly serious over which protein powder and who could use it and when. And it's just amazing how worked up people were getting about their protein powder. Anyway, so we do need to eat. It is necessary. But we also need to recognize that if we wish to attain awakening, then no matter what we do with our lives, whatever aspect of our lives we're relating to, we need to relate to it in a way which is conducive to awakening, which means something which reduces our defilements and increases our wisdom. So the most basic guideline for this is the contemplation of the four requisites, in which the Buddha gives a brief guideline of the overall philosophy of how to relate to food in Buddhism. So he says that a monk should reflect. Why is he reflecting? I use alms food, not for fun, not for pleasure, not for adornment, not for beauty, only for the nourishment and health of this body and for sustaining my spiritual practice. So this is the basic outline of our attitude towards food. So why do we eat food? We need to remind ourselves of the purpose. And although this is particularly part of monastic life, this reflection is universal enough that it can also be used by any lay person. So why do we have food? Well, it's not for fun, not for pleasure, not for adornment. In other words, not for showing off, and not for beauty. So we're not trying to eat so that we'll be more attractive. Or conversely, we're not trying to avoid certain foods or take on diets in order to be more attractive. But rather we eat for the nourishment and health of the body. And we do that because keeping our body alive and healthy is a support to our spiritual practice. So it's always about practice, keeping the mind focused on cultivating wholesome states. And in monastic life, we additionally take on the practice of not eating after noon. So only eating between dawn and midday. So usually in many monasteries, that's breakfast and lunch. And in some monasteries, it's actually only one meal. So usually somewhere in the middle of the morning, one has a single rather large meal, and that's it for the entire day. And this is a practice of helping us to really look at our relationship with food in terms of you can't just eat whenever you want. You can only eat at a particular time of day. So when the desire for food arises at other times of day, it's necessary to examine that desire and recognize where it's coming from. Usually it's not coming from a genuine necessity for nourishment, but rather it's coming from some kind of craving or discomfort or boredom or something going on in the mind, which doesn't actually have anything to do with nourishing the body. And even if it does have to do with nourishing the body, well, keeping in mind that you can live for up to 2 months without eating anything, which means you can live until the next morning. So it's actually perfectly fine. Even if you didn't get quite enough to eat that morning, it's okay. Just wait till the next morning and have a bit more then. So that's one of the real benefits of this practice, is that it helps one to examine one's relationship with food through practicing restraint throughout about 3/4 of the day. And this is also a practice, even if one is eating in the evening, one can set clear limits around when. So a practice which a number of Buddhist lay people I know have taken on is the practice of no snacking. So having designated meal times, maybe breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but not eating anything in between those meal times. It's another example of how one can adopt a similar principle of restricting the times and locations where one eats, so that one is not just indulging one's craving without examining those cravings at all. And in the monastic world, there's also a handful of things that we can have in the evening, and what we commonly call allowables. This includes things like fruit juice, it's pretty universally accepted, things like fruit juice and honey, universally accepted, and some others which are dependent upon the monastery, such as dark chocolate. It's another relatively common one. In the Thai tradition, commonly cheese is allowed in the evening, which tends to raise eyebrows for those who are not used to the concept of allowables. And we also have the concept of medicines. So medicines, which one can I have at any time of day as well. So that's a very brief overview of the topic. It's also relatively common to take on specific practices. So one of the specific practices which is common in monastic life is to eat whatever's offered. So not to express preferences for one particular food or another, but just to receive whatever's offered and to accept that this is what we have for the day. So this is for example, the practice of alms round. One is just gratefully receiving whatever is given, and whether it's what you want or what you don't want doesn't matter because it's all you have. As a brief introduction to the topic, Bhante Jay, would you like to talk a bit about the relationship to food within the context of Buddhist practice?
Yeah, sure. I guess we could talk about, well, to piggyback a little bit off of what Bhante said in terms of when we went over the requisites, there's a very powerful simile that the Buddha uses, and it's quite graphic, and it's quite, the Buddha sometimes uses similes that are meant to kind of be a punch, to kind of like make a point. And so this, this one simile is called the child's flesh, right? And the simile goes that suppose there were parents and they were crossing the desert with their child, and they were halfway through and they didn't have anything, and they realized that if something wasn't done, that they would all perish. So they decided to, kill the child and eat the flesh, right? And so the Buddha gives this simile. He's like, they're eating the child, the flesh, and they're saying, "Oh, where has my child gone?" And every time I say that, I said, "Well, I mean, in their mouth. That's where it's going." But anyway, so the Buddha says, the point is, the Buddha says, would these parents enjoy and be enraptured by this food, or would they just eat the food just to survive? And the bhikkhus say, well, just to survive. And then Buddha says, well, this is how you should view food. Right? The Buddha's making a very extreme, simile to make the point of making sure that you view food for what it is. Now, of course, if you look, it's an almost human universal that people get together around food, right? Families, how many, probably thousands, tens, 20s, thousands of years of humans have gotten around the fireplace or the dinner table or whatever, right? So food is a social thing as well, right? So we use food for all kinds of different ways other than just what we really need it for, which is to survive. And so the Buddha wants us to focus in on, why do we really need it? And one of the major practices is practicing mindfulness of eating. So right, when you are practicing satipatthana, right, you're practicing foundations of mindfulness, and under sampajanya, under clear comprehension, the Buddha says to be clearly aware when you're walking, lying down, going back and forth, eating. Right? So the Buddha wants you to be fully aware of, okay, I am eating. And what this does is actually the paying attention to your eating really actually helps you to understand the difference between your wants and your needs. Right? You don't necessarily need that, I don't know, fancy Starbucks coffee or whatever. You don't necessarily need whatever the higher level of food, where you can have the regular level of food, right? You reflect on what you really want and what you really need. Like for instance, for myself, right? There's for the most part, I can eat anything for the most part. There's certain things like some like Indian food. There's spices I think I'm kind of allergic to. I have lots of issues with. And so when I have food, sometimes I reflect on, okay, do I not like this because I'm being a baby and I just don't like the taste of it? Or is it actually something that is impacting me, right? So that actually makes me be able to investigate my mind and say, well, is this real? Is my worries or complaints about this food real? And if I reflect it, I say, no, I'm not. I'm just being a baby. And then it's like, okay, well, buck up and just eat the thing. Just get used to it, whatever it is, right? And of course, as a monastic, that's something that it's much more part of our lives, right? If you're a lay person, you can just go to whatever store or restaurant or whatever and get whatever you like. But as a layperson, that can also be something that could be a field of practice. That can be a field of practice. Do you need so much stuff in your pantry? Do you need to get this when you could get that? The difference between needs and wants. Reflecting on that little difference can actually bring about a lot of insight. And I think that's the restrictions of the monastic code on eating does just that. I think it was a couple live streams ago I mentioned that there is you can read in the Vinaya and the Suttas how it came about that monastics were only allowed to eat up to solar noon, right? Initially, it kind of flip-flopped a little bit around. I think at one point it was, okay, the Buddha says, okay, no lunch, but you can have breakfast and dinner. And then finally the Buddha's like, okay, no dinner because, night and things were monks were being, mistaken as bandits and things like that. All kinds of stuff was happening. So the Buddha says, okay, no going into the village at night. And then, the one monk who's infamously recorded 2,600 years later saying, but supper is the best meal, right? So we can see, this is our craving. What do we really need? And especially in, growing up, part of this is going to be the Italian thing. Part of it's going to be the American thing. But growing up, it was just like, if my plate was empty, well, my Italian grandmother or my mother would just put more food on my plate. And I just, okay, well, I guess I'll just eat it. And it's only just been, some of you probably know I have lifelong food issues and things like that. And I was very, very overweight years and years ago. And one of the things that I've realized is, like, for the most part, I just eat one meal a day now. And that has been a progression. It's not like something I just decided I wanted to do, but it was something that I progressed into doing. And what I started to realize was, like, I actually don't need as much food as I thought. Like my perception of what a portion is way higher than like what an average person actually needs. Right. So that's another thing to reflect on. Like, how much food do you actually need versus how much food do you want, or do you just eat because you're being social and you're not paying attention to what you're eating? I guess that's what I wanted to focus more on, like the mindfulness aspect of paying attention to eating. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would like to bring forward as well, and this is a point which often gets overlooked, particularly in monasteries, but it's good to remember that part of the reflection that the Buddha gives about food is that we should be eating things which are nourishing and supportive to one's health. Yavadeva imasikaya satitiya yapanaya vihingsu paratya. So something which helps the body to continue going, so keeps the body stable and able to function correctly. So titya yapanaya, so keeping it stable and functioning correctly. And vihingsu paratya means that prevents any damage to the body. So these are two important elements of our relationship to food. Is again, often what we tend to do, just the ordinary relationship to food, is that we tend to be thinking what's going to be pleasant, what has a nice flavor, what has a nice texture, what feels good in the mouth and feels good in the stomach. So we tend to be relating to food as a source of entertainment. And so a classic example of this is the broad category of what we call junk food. Things which are not particularly nutritious and in fact might even be downright hazardous to your health. Thinking of Cheetos, I think Cheetos have more toxic chemicals in them than actual food content.
I like Cheetos.
They're delicious. There's no denying they're delicious, but you're never going to see me putting Cheetos in my body because that would be breaking the reflection on food.
It's like the poison, right? But the craving simile.
Yeah.
Drinking the poison even though it tastes good. Yeah.
Delicious beverage mixed with poison. I think he's talking about beer on that one. Delicious. Anyway, or alcohol in general, actually. There's alcoholic beverages can be delicious, but they're quite literally mixed with poison. But yeah, reflecting on food and that we do want to be careful to eat things which are supportive and nourishing to one's health. So sometimes there's this idea of, well, you just eat whatever's offered. And that's true. That is one practice that we do, as I mentioned earlier. But there also needs to be a consideration to how the foods you're eating are affecting your body and mind, and whether or not it's actually supportive to your health and supportive to your spiritual practice. And you don't want to get too neurotic about this, of course, but just keeping that as a general principle, that avoiding things which are unhealthy to one's body is actually a part of the Buddhist relationship to food.
I remember years ago as a layperson online, somebody made a comment like, well, if all I did was just give monks Oreo cookies, is that they would have to eat the Oreo cookies? And I said, and this is me as a layperson thinking about being a monk, and I said, yeah, basically. And Bhatta Yuttadhammo comes on and says, no, if it's just Oreo cookies, then no, I can say no. Right?
Yeah.
And that was like a, that was like an instant where like, oh yeah, okay, so then it's more complicated than just you just have to accept everything.
Yeah. So although we do have certain rules that we're not allowed to request specific foods, there's an exception to that if it's necessary for one's health. So actually in that case, if somebody really was just giving you a bowl full of Oreos every day, then it would be completely within the vinaya to say like, friend, for the sake of my health, it would be really nice to have something a little bit healthier. So it's, again, the Buddha was very practical. And this isn't always immediately apparent when one first encounters, especially the monastic rules. But the Buddha was very practical. He was very concerned with how to create a system whereby his followers could both cultivate wholesome mind states, but without needing to sacrifice their health and sanity in the process. So maybe we can look at some of the questions for a bit more inspiration. So Lochana says, after the noontime, do you only drink fluids? Galanpasa. So Galanpasa, this is the Sri Lankan pronunciation of the Pali Galana Pachaya. So Galana means sickness and Pachaya means support. So Galana Pachaya means supports for sickness. So it means medicines or things which are supportive to one's health, especially in times of illness. And in Sri Lankan Buddhism, this term is commonly used to refer to anything which one is allowed to consume after noon, which is not only fluids. As I mentioned earlier, some of the more commonly recognized evening allowables are fruit juice and honey. There's many others, so tea and coffee, except in Burma for some reason.
Well, if they're Sri Lankan, they would know ghee too.
Ghee, yeah. Butter, oil. But the thing is, many of these things are actually solids at room temperature. For example, coconut oil is a solid at room temperature. Ghee is solid at room temperature. So whether something is liquid or solid is not actually how you determine whether or not it's allowable. Similarly, honey. Honey is sometimes solid at room temperature, depending upon the kind of honey. So it's more complicated than whether things are fluid or liquid. Also, virtually anything can be made into a liquid with a little bit of creativity. So that's definitely not the criteria. Yeah, it's much more complex than that. But one basic overall summary, and this doesn't nail it down perfectly, but it gets you the general idea, is that most of the evening allowables fall into one of three categories. They're either some variant on sugar, such as fruit juice, honey, maple syrup, agave nectar, and so on. Or there's some variant on fat, such as oils or butter, things of that nature. Or there's some kind of medicine, such as coffee or tea. So most of them fit into one of those three categories. There's a few outliers which are a bit harder to categorize. For example, the Buddha allowed rice broth, bean broth, and meat broth in the evening, which don't neatly fit into any of those three categories. So it's much more complicated than just whether something is liquid or solid. But a general guideline is things which are either sugars, fats, or medicines. Anything else you want to say on that?
No.
Okay. And Yuri says, since I visited the monastery, I have been eating almost like a monk. Great. Morning
Morning and big lunch, dinner.
big maybe big lunch or
Okay.
dinner between 1 to 4, a snack at 5 p.m., and that's it. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, if one is not a monastic, then you don't strictly need to follow the no food afternoon thing, but rather coming up with some kind of structure for your relationship with food is a useful way of getting some mirror on your mind. Something on your mind?
Well, I just
Yeah. Well, let me finish up
Yeah,
her
sure,
question,
sure.
and then we can take yours. And you say you lost weight. Okay, and if you needed to lose weight, then I guess that's good for your health, if it's good for your health. Though keeping in mind that's not our main purpose. We're not trying to get, if one is losing weight for the sake of one's health, that's fine. But if one is losing weight for the sake of attractiveness, that's kind of missing the point. Your blood sugar is stable, good. Yeah. Yeah, this is, we're trying to keep the body healthy while also supporting the cultivation of a wholesome mind. You have a question?
Yossi, you spoke about this a little bit, Bante. I was just wondering about using the sensations that we have that we might call hunger, those sensations, as mindfulness of the body, but also looking at impermanence. It's one of the things I notice, like something I might normally, oh, I'm hungry, but it fades and just kind of seeing it go up and down, up and down.
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, so this is the question is about like dealing with the feelings of hunger and observing them as impermanence. Yeah, this is, what I've noticed myself is that we have such a drive. Obviously, we have to have this drive, but when we have hunger, it really kind of hijacks all your systems, and it makes it feel like it's more. It makes it feel like it's more important than it is, right? Because it's like the minute you're hungry, it's like your mind is saying you need food or else you're gonna die. And of course, when we were on the plains or whatever, when we were hunter-gatherers, then yeah, we actually we didn't know if we were gonna have food for days, right? So we had to find food, so we had that. But now we don't have to hunter-gather anything anywhere except for the local, shop market, actually, or Amazon even, right? So we have to be wary of this. Like, well, what is this hunger, right? Try to observe it, like the feeling of hunger. What does it feel like in the body? What does it feel like in the mind? Like when I do multiple day fasts, what I'll notice, even like halfway through the first day, I'll notice that I have trouble concentrating on anything else because my mind becomes so focused on food. And I'm hoping that after I do enough of these fasts, I get used to it. But I'm observing my productivity during a multiple day fast is basically done because my mind is just so, even though I'm not hungry, my mind is focused on food. So, whenever you have the hunger, it's just like another unpleasant experience, right? And so you observe that unpleasant experience, you investigate, you understand what it is, right? Like since I got into like intermittent fasting and really learning about these things, like there's a study that says, like in rats and different mammals, they found that like if you're a little bit starved, they actually live like 30% longer. So if I'm like, hungry, I'm like, that's the feeling of living 30% longer. All right. So I kind of like reflect on that and use these things. The other thing is, when I've been most hungry is actually at night often. And what I found is if I go to bed and I wake up the next morning, I'm not hungry. Like it's almost like, I kind of like hack that by just going, okay, I know I'm hungry, but I'll tell myself, that if you go to bed and you wake up, you won't be hungry. Right? And I go to bed and I wake up and I'm not hungry. So it's really about observing and understanding that and really knowing your body's messages. That's the most important thing, really knowing your body's messages. Also, this comes in handy to know that you're full. That's a whole other thing. Like Ajahn Chah had the thing, like to try to eat until you're about 5 bites left, and then drink water and you're done. Right. So like that's a practice of knowing when you're full. And I can even like recognize, like I have a series of burps that happen basically when my stomach is done. Like when I'm ready to stop, like the burps come up. So like you focus on your body and you can observe these things. You know it very, very deeply. And so hunger is a message. And just like how when we have pain and we observe the pain and we realize we're actually making it worse, it's the same thing with hunger, right? It's just a message that's pinging in our mind, and we can make it worse, or we can observe it and understand it for what it is and, deal with it as we need to.
And Frank says, I'm curious how monks go about getting used to eating like this. Beyond simply being used to eating whenever one wants, the body simply isn't used to eating large amounts of calories at once.
Yes.
So how do you get used to eating like this? You just do it. And you get used to it. That's how. So it's amazing what you can get used to. You just do it. And you discover that you're capable of far more than you think you're capable of. So if you want to prove you're able to do this, then just do it. There's a very small percentage of people, maybe 1% of people, who have some kind of serious digestive issue, and they actually literally can't do this. But that's quite rare. The vast majority of people are perfectly capable eating once or twice a day, only in the morning, and then they don't eat the other 18 hours of the day. It's actually quite fine. But in the beginning, usually the first week or two, if you're not used to this, the first week or two can be a little bit challenging because you're going to feel like you're hungry all the time. You're going to have a really hard time figuring out the right amount to eat. You'll either eat way too little or way too much. And you're going to be thinking about food constantly. But then after a little while, you get used to it. So you just get used to it by doing it. You figure out the right amount to eat, and you realize that actually you're fine. Even if you have not quite enough one day or a little bit too much the next day, it's actually fine. It all kind of balances out over time. And you start to realize that actually you're okay, and those sensations in your body really aren't as important as we think they are, as Bhante Jay was saying just now. Now you start to piece out the distinction between the actual needs of the body versus our psychological chaos in relationship to food. So it's actually a tremendously fruitful practice, which is why, of course, for monastics, we do this every day. But also the Buddha recommended that lay people do this on every Uposatha day. So to take a day when you examine your relationship to food, practicing restraint, in relationship to food.
I don't know. It was quite hard for me, but I'm a bit of a special case because I had weight loss surgery and I had a smaller stomach, a pretty small stomach. So getting used to 1 or 2 meals crammed into 3-hour period was pretty rough. I was also eating post weight loss surgery. I was eating 6 small meals a day. I was not eating for years. I was not used to having big meals. And yeah, so for a while it was quite hard. I probably actually still would prefer, like if I disrobed and went to lay life, I would eat 6 small meals a day again. I think that's the best for my body, but this is one of the things as a monk you have to kind of deal with. You deal with it. It could be a lot worse, and you just figure it out and you test and you explore and you investigate and you do trial and error, and then you get used to it as much as you can anyway.
See, I would actually be inclined, if I could make up my own food rules, I'd be more inclined to have like breakfast and dinner. Like that would make more sense to me, like 12 hours apart. That would make a lot of sense to me. But that's not the rules we have. So that's another preference that I get to just put on the shelf for never. So in the back of my mind, I have the never shelf, and that's on that shelf.
When I had my 6 small meals a day, I was never hungry and I was never full. It was just like a perfect equilibrium that I was in. I liked it.
And Frank further says, these days I stick to 2 at most 3 meals a day and have mostly given up snacking. Okay. On Uposita days, I'll have 1 or 2 meals in the morning and a snack of allowables in the evening. Great, yeah. And he says, these days I've noticed that the allowables on Uposita is mostly an excuse to eat an expensive chocolate bar. LOL. Which I guess is both skillful in noticing and not skillful in doing. What's the big deal? So you have a chocolate bar on Uposita. Yeah, so? What's the big deal? Why are you making this a big deal in your mind? But if you think it's too much, well, then have less. I remember when I was a junior monk, I could eat an entire chocolate bar by myself in the evening. And as the years went by, it reduced and reduced and reduced, and now it's more like a quarter of a bar, if that. So, yeah, if you think it's too much, well, then next time have less. And look at your mind, look at your relationship, what's going on. And also paying attention to your body. Do you actually need it? So if you eat sufficiently in the morning, then sometimes you actually don't need allowables at all. Allowables are meant to be a little something extra if you're feeling weak or fatigued, or if your blood sugar is low, or you're feeling kind of run down and you need a little something to pick you up and carry you through the rest of the evening. So if you're just doing it because it's the Uposita and now's the time when you eat a big bar of chocolate, well, that's missing the point. So have a closer look. First off, do you actually need to have it? Second, how much is actually useful and appropriate? Okay.
One of the things for the allowables is like I can remember when I last Vasa, when I was with the bhikkhunis, and would just get my little pieces of cheese or little chocolate and whatever, I get my allowables, and I realized it's not really, because I was only eating the 1 meal a day, and it's like, it doesn't really add anything. It's not like that much calories. It is really only because I just it's something that's available and I'll just eat it. And then one of the seminarians, she said, what, it's good for blood pressure though, or not blood sugar, like keeping like blood sugars. And I said, I guess that makes, it's not a bad thing. Like you did mention something like that. So.
Okay, and then we have 2 related questions. So Lochana says, people misunderstood Buddhists are not allowed to eat meat. And similarly, John says, how important are vegetarian or vegan diets in relation to Dhamma or the suttas? I've noticed there's much more of an emphasis on it in Mahayana traditions than in Theravada.
I was actually going to cut it off at the pass and just actually talk about it in my introduction, because I knew vegetarianism was going to come up in one way or another.
Yeah, and so it is good to talk about the topic of meat, the topic of vegetarianism and veganism. So as far as what's in the suttas, the keeping in mind that what we find in the suttas is it's actually mostly aimed at monastics. So this is one of the traits of Buddhism as a whole, and especially early Buddhism, is the Buddha was really focused on monks. And of course, there's a lot of teachings for lay people as well. But most of what the Buddha was teaching was very clearly his audience was monks, and he was tailoring what he was saying for their benefit. And so these are alms mendicants, people who rely upon gifts of food from others in order for their survival. And who therefore have very little room for preference, very little room for deciding what they're going to get and what they're going to eat. So during the time of the Buddha, one of his followers actually asked if there could be a rule of requiring vegetarianism, and the Buddha said no. The Buddha said that he would not allow there to be such a rule, and the reason for that is, he said, there will be times when monks will be going alms and they'll be offered meat, and if they refuse it, then they won't get enough food to eat. So the Buddha said, out of compassion for the monks, acknowledging that there will be times when they won't be able to get by without accepting meat, then he would not make it a rule to require vegetarianism. He did make some specific rules around meat. So one is that we cannot receive meat or fish if we suspect that the animal was killed specifically for us. So an example of this is many years ago, a fisherman came to the monastery and he said, I'll go out fishing and catch a bunch of fish for the monastery. And we had to tell him, no, you can't. If you want to fish for anybody else, that's fine, but you cannot kill fish specifically for monks. We can't allow that to happen. So that's a case where the Buddha actually does require the monks to reject an offering of meat, because if you know the animal was killed for you. There's also certain kinds of meat that we're not allowed to receive, such as the meat of humans. We're not allowed to eat humans. There's also a handful of others: elephants, horses, dogs, snakes, a few peculiar things like that, which don't come up that often. I can't remember the last time somebody offered me elephant meat. It just doesn't happen that much. And another interesting bit is the Buddha says when we eat meat, we should reflect on what it is. This also I find very interesting. So instead of just being like, cheeseburgers are delicious, instead it's like, I am eating the ground up corpse of a sentient being. And you still eat it, because sometimes you need to eat things. But you remind yourself that that's what it is. You're actually eating the dead corpse of a sentient being. And there is also the concept of compassion. So if you do have enough choice in your life in order to choose a vegetarian diet, and if your body is able to function on a vegetarian diet, which is the case for most people, but there's a small percentage of people who it actually doesn't work very well for them. But if you have enough food choice in your life to be vegetarian, and your body is able to support a healthy life in that way, then yeah, I think generally speaking, it's a good thing. As a way of reducing the suffering that's being inflicted upon sentient beings, it is a good thing to do. But yeah, in the Theravada system, it's not strictly required for anyone, either lay people or monastics. The advent of mandatory vegetarianism is something which arose when Buddhism went to China. So it's actually only found in 2 Mahayana sutras, both of which contemporary scholars believe were composed in China, so not in India. So something which was produced over 1,000 years after the Buddha's time in a different country. So there's a cultural context for that, but it's not something which can be reliably traced to the Buddha. Anything else on that?
Well, no, there's just a few things to add. It's like reading like the rules about that and like with David Datta, and so it reminds me, it's just like even like 2,600 years ago, vegetarianism was a divisive issue. Right? People thought about it back then just like they do today. And I find it wise that the Buddha basically gave it as because I'm pretty sure in that rule, the Buddha actually says that something to the effect of if the monks want to, that they can be vegetarian, right? So the Buddha is giving them an option, basically. Like the Buddha is saying, like, if this is something that you feel that you need to have as part of your practice, then you can be. Of course, obviously understanding that does kind of limit, the people who are giving you food, right? So that does kind of put it in position, and as you mentioned. But I think that's a very wise thing that the Buddha left it up as an option, right? And I think that because I think some people, it's a very, very serious thing for their practice, and some people it's not. And I don't think that either one is more moral than the other per se. I think it's just an inclination of the person. I think that's what I wanted. Oh, the other thing was about the monks, the not killing for the monks. I'm going to put my anthropology cap on, but this is it's a near human universal of human hospitality, that if you have a special guest coming to you, well, what do? You kill off the best animal of your herd to offer it. It's like a sacrifice to that special person, right? To say, oh, look, I've done this, I've killed off my best animal for you. And so obviously in ancient India, all of a sudden now there's these wonderful Buddhist monks, and people are like, oh, these monks we're going to start killing all the, right? So the Buddha kind of put this into place as a way to kind of cut that off at the pass, right? So that, the people are not slaughtering a bunch of animals just specifically for Buddhist monks. So it's an interesting, I guess, an interesting little tidbit I wanted to add there.
Yeah. And a related topic, Guy Ford asks, are monks allowed to eat cheese? Can they eat cheese? Yes, we most certainly can eat cheese. Yes.
Before or after?
Well, in all Buddhist traditions, you can eat cheese before noon. In Thailand, you can also have cheese after noon. But this is a controversial point in the rest of the Theravada world. So in Thailand, it's universally accepted that cheese is an evening allowable. But in the rest of the Theravada world, it's pretty universally rejected. So this is one of the points of debate between different Buddhist countries.
And don't ask us to explain, because it gets down to like literally like lawyering. It's really deep, really complicated stuff.
It's surprising how far down the rabbit hole you can go when you start talking about cheese in the evening.
Yeah.
And then Bill has an off-topic question about exercise. Probably better to bring that to Monk Chat tomorrow evening.
Yeah.
And Facebook user has a question about intermittent fasting. I actually have no idea what intermittent fasting is.
Well, I mean, technically, if you're eating like a monk, it's technically intermittent fasting. But intermittent fasting as it is today, meaning that you only take in calories during a certain point, like an 8 hour. So I try to only take in any kind of calories within that 8 to 10 hour frame. And then the rest of it's just water. So that's all that means. So it's like you're literally not taking calories at all, even drinks during that time frame. That's what intermittent fasting is when we think about it today.
Yeah, but it's good to keep in mind, though, that there's a motivation behind any fasting practice that one does. So in Buddhism, our motivation is to support our spiritual practice. So it's to support self-restraint, self-awareness. It's to be easy to support in the case of the monks. But fundamentally, it's about helping us to cultivate the quality of contentment and wisdom. Whereas, generally speaking, if people are doing intermittent fasting as the latest health craze, then it doesn't really have anything to do with spiritual practice. So much of what we do in Buddhism, you can do exactly the same thing, but with different motivations, and then it's not Buddhism. So this is the case with intermittent fasting. I guess technically, many Buddhist monks are doing intermittent fasting every day, but that's not the purpose. We're not doing it for the sake of fasting. We're doing it for the sake of training and developing the mind. It's not really about the body, it's about the mind.
There is a lot of good scientific studies, though, that shows the benefits of doing that. And that might be a good reason why many, many monks live to a long age. Not all.
Not all.
But many.
That's true.
Yeah.
And Frank, that's a bit off topic. So maybe, Frank, you can bring your question about the Ngorjur Nikaya to Monk Chat tomorrow. Ricky says, Anaposita, do you think it is just as beneficial and acceptable to shift the eating time to a different 6-hour period to accommodate work schedule and lay responsibilities? I personally don't have any problem with that. Just really ask yourself why you're doing it. So if you're doing it because your favorite pizzeria is open in the evening and not in the morning, one, I feel you. I really do feel you. But that's also exactly what the Buddha was saying, as Bhante Jay mentioned earlier in the story where the monk is like, but the best food is in the evening. Why are you making us giving up the best food of the day? So just make sure that you don't have another motive for shifting the time of day. But if that really is how it is, then that's how it is. Sometimes a small shift is sufficient. So for example, during summertime, you have actually until about 1 o'clock because of solar noon, because of daylight savings time. So if somebody wanted to keep that also during the winter as their own practice, again, in monastic circles, that would be frowned upon, but as a lay person, it's an understandable adjustment. So you just really ask yourself why you want to shift the timing. And if your reasoning actually is airtight and not motivated by defilement, then I think it's okay. But if there's any way to just stick to the classic timing, I would recommend sticking to the classic timing.
Yeah, the Buddha did it really for a practical reason. Like, it's not like the Buddha just decided, okay, this is how it's going to be. There were practical reasons. So if you're really trying to do the same, do the same kind of thing, but you have to shift the time around, it would be much harder to do that as a monastic because there's a whole other reasons why that's not going to happen. But as a layperson, yeah, why not?
Okay, and Kristen asks, in keeping the 8 precepts, I'm a bit confused about the type of milk allowables. Are seed milks okay, but nut milk not allowable, and definitely no cow milk? So the ones which you'll see in some monasteries are usually soy milk, which fits under the allowance for bean broth. And sometimes rice milk, which fits under the allowance for rice broth. So those two, one can make a very good argument from the Vinaya. A little bit dodgier is almond milk. And the justification that's used here is that an almond is technically a fruit, which means almond milk is technically a fruit juice. In my mind, this is stretching the logic a little bit, but it's harmless enough, so I'm not going to make a fuss about it. In my mind, that's kind of in the same category as cheese. So almond milk and cheese, they're both in that category where I'm like, I'm not so sure about this, but whatever. harmless enough, I guess. But other things like sunflower seed milk, I would personally say no. Cashew milk, I would say no. Yeah, and just really look at it like, why do you want to have all these things in the evening anyway? Is it really necessary? Keep it simple. When in doubt, just keep it simple. Okay. Anything else? No. And Sud says, I eat only once a day. Wow, congratulations. But it has not helped me curb my sensual desire. Should I let this idea that eating once a day will help decrease sensual desire go? Do you have thoughts?
Well, are you talking about just sensual desire in general or sensual desire related to food? Because it might be different depending on which, but to expect any one practice to curb sensual desire in general might be asking a little bit too much of it. Right? Practicing sense restraint is an all-encompassing thing. It's not just about what you eat, it's about what you pay attention to, what you're looking at, all kinds of different aspects of your experience. Is practicing sensual desire related to food and in general. Okay. So yeah. So no, and of course, just if you eat once a day, are you going to be like, well, I really want this food. I can only eat once a day, so I want to only get in what I want the most, right? And then you say, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this, and then it's all on the plate. But then your stomach gets full, and you want to just keep putting it in your mouth, but you just can't do it anymore, and you have to put it away, and then you just pine away. Wow, man, I guess I'm going to have to wait a whole 24 hours for that food. Right? Practice lots of mindfulness of eating. Practice lots of reflecting on what the food is. Like one of a basic reflection is, yeah, this food is like going to be pleasurable, but God, it only lasts like 3 bites. And then I have to keep having it again. It's like a drug. It's like, it's like for a second or two, you get the nice hit, but then it's gone and I have to get the next hit. Right? And you just reflect on these aspects of the food. And that will allow you, for instance, like I really try to have no carb, like not no carbs, but as much carbs as I possibly can, because it really works best for my body. But boy, when I see a croissant on the table, I was like, oh man. Or like people might think like Bhante J never, he doesn't like bread or toast or anything like that. And I'm like, I got fat because of bagels and toast. I love all of that stuff. But I reflect on the downsides of it. It's like, yeah, it makes me feel a little bit sluggish, and it tastes great, but it's like it's not going to help me after. So reflect on these different aspects. So it's basically reflecting on the gratification, the danger, and the escape. That's what the Buddha says to reflect on. This is gratifying. You need to know why it's gratifying, not just, oh, it's just gratifying, so I avoid it. You have to know it deeply. Why is this gratifying? The taste, the texture, etc. Then the downsides, the drawbacks. Oh, the taste goes away, and then I feel sluggish, or I get fat, or whatever. And then the escape is always the letting go of the craving towards that. Right? So when it comes to croissants, I have a pretty good idea of the gratification, the danger, and the escape. So I can, say, it might be good, but I don't need it. And it took me a lot of years to get to that point, but it works.
And Diego says, I understand the spirit of not eating afternoon to be related to self-awareness of desire and craving in the case of a layperson keeping the precept. Therefore, I think allowables afternoon only makes sense if you're about to pass out or feeling unwell. I think it could be against the spirit of the precept to try and find out what one can and can't eat afternoon. Thoughts? I think you're taking this a little too seriously. First off, knowing what one can and can't have afternoon actually is important, because while you're correct that the general principle is actually to look at one's relationship to food and to practice restraint and self-awareness and so on. The Buddha did also allow certain things to be had after noon because they're relatively harmless and don't and aren't really a big problem, and they do give one an opportunity to either perk up the body a little bit or get another way of looking at one's relationship to food. So for example, before I became a monk, I was never much of a fan of dark chocolate. I preferred milk chocolate. But then I discovered that you can't have milk chocolate after noon, but you can have dark chocolate. And suddenly I became a fan of dark chocolate. So interesting how this happens.
Same thing. Yeah.
And now, like, when I see milk chocolate, my mind is kind of like, oh, really? Because it's like, what's the point? Like,
yeah. Or when somebody gives us like a bunch of dark chocolates, but they all have almonds in it, and I'm like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a shame.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a general point, yeah, if you want to practice not having anything at all after noon, that's a great practice. And if you do need something, then it's good to know what is allowable so that you know what you can have after noon.
No, it is a good practice. And in all honesty, the evening allowables didn't really become that important to me until I started eating one meal a day. Like at Bhavana, we never actually, we had chocolate every once in a while when somebody would bring it. Like you go to like some of like the bigger places like a Vaigiri or whatever, they always have a good stock of allowables before us Dhamma, etc. But Bhavana, it was just like, if somebody just decided to bring some chocolate, then you had some chocolate. And so I didn't really it wasn't a thing for me, but once I started to have one meal a day, it actually did help with it helped me just for my mind to kind of have that, okay, I had a little something at night, right? And it's allowable. I had a little something at night. And then my mind is like, okay, that's good. I'm good till the next day, right? It can be a help, depending on the situation, or it can be a hindrance. You have to know, as Dante said, you have to reflect on it and see if it works for you.
And Anonymous says, if you put fruit, ice, and water in a blender, can that be unallowable? You're halfway there. The next step would be to strain out all of the solids. So fruit juice and fruit smoothie are different things. The difference is that fruit juice has had the solids strained out, so it's just the liquid from the fruit, whereas a fruit smoothie is a whole fruit that's been pureed. So you're halfway there.
So like an example would be orange juice would be allowable. Orange juice with pulp would not be allowable.
And this gets into where there's differences from monastery to monastery in terms of how obsessive they get around this. And the Vinaya doesn't actually offer any helpful guidelines about what pulp content is acceptable or not acceptable. But yeah, if you are literally just pureeing a whole piece of fruit, there is nobody in the Vinaya world that would agree that that's fruit juice. Nobody. Mm-hmm. You have to make at least a token effort to strain it.
Yeah, and just like the what you said, the meat broth and the bean broth and these broths are literally just broth. They're not like with little chunks of beans or little chunks of meat or whatever in it. It's just literally the liquid, right? It's water that's flavored is basically what it is.
Yeah, and has various trace vitamins and minerals and so on. Yeah. And Diego says, meaning if you're not feeling well, wouldn't it be okay to just eat anything? Yeah, in the morning. In the morning, you can eat whatever you want. But in the evening, if you're following this practice of not eating after noon, then you have extremely limited options. And it's very interesting to explore what that does to the mind. Of course, if you actually are genuinely sick to the point where you genuinely are not able to survive eating only in the morning, then that's a different topic. Go ahead.
If I recall, this is one of the rare rules where the Buddha does not give the allowance for eating after the allowable time if you're sick. So technically, even if you're sick, you're still not allowed to eat after the allowable times. It's one of the rare times where that's not a non-offense.
Yeah, so generally speaking, one can, especially if one is taking a looser interpretation of allowables, you can still come up with lots of options for the evening. And that said, I do know of a handful of cases of a monk who really did have some kind of serious health condition and had to have something in the evening. It does happen, but it's something that one avoids because usually the motivation is defilement rather than health. So whenever possible, just stick to the precepts.
Mm-hmm.
And LK has a question. This is kind of borderline off topic, but maybe I'll give a short answer. LK says, what do you think about microdosing on shrooms? Enough where it's not mind-altering, but increases focus?
That has nothing to do with food.
No, but it's technically in the domain of medicine, but maybe...
Okay.
I mean, it might be better to save for monk chat tomorrow.
I couldn't even answer it at all anyway, so that would be, if you could answer it, you could answer it. But
well,
I would have no idea.
But actually, my answer is I actually don't know enough to really say anything about this because actually many medicines are mind-altering, but if taken in small quantities for medicinal purposes, they're okay. So the one which commonly comes up is painkillers. So if you eat 80 milligrams of OxyContin, then you're going to be really stoned. But if you take 5 milligrams to treat an ongoing health problem, then your mindfulness is still going to be pretty sharp. It isn't necessarily going to be a problem. So I actually don't, and I've heard of microdosing, but I really don't know how it affects the mind, so I can't speak with any clarity on it. But you don't want to be doing anything that's going to at all weaken your mindfulness and self-restraint. And you also don't want to be doing anything that's going to be introducing chaos or confusion into the mind. So you need to be very careful and very self-aware with these things. And really, whenever possible, one should only be consuming medicines when one really needs to. You have a thought on this?
I'm sorry. I think also that is not prescribed by a doctor, and I believe that's illegal in most places. And so that'd be another case where I think it might be problematic.
Well, as far as legality, it depends upon where you go. There's states in the US where it's legal currently. Of course, there's countries in other parts of the world where it's legal. So legality isn't the point here. The point is it necessary for one's health? So in other words, is it actually being used as a medicine? And second, is it obstructive to one's spiritual development? Those are the important questions.
Jay Kala has a good on-topic question.
Jay Kala says, I thought that allowables came from allowables for ill monks, not in general. Is this wrong? So there's categories here. So some are things that can be consumed at any time for any reason, which includes fruit juice, for example. You can have it at any time for any reason. You don't even need a reason, actually. But then other ones, one does need to have some sensation or condition which is alleviated by having the allowable. Go ahead.
Well, it depends on what you mean by ill. Right?
Yeah.
The word used does have, I believe, a few different contexts. Of course, in modern times, the word has been expanded to mean a lot of different things. Like, the whole one can't ride in a vehicle unless they're ill. And then, you say, well, ill means if you can't walk like 10 miles, like they can expand it. But yeah.
Yeah, so the definition of ill gets taken pretty broadly in most monasteries that I'm aware of. So even, for example, feeling a bit fatigued from not having eaten in 6 hours would be considered sufficient reason.
That's a good question.
It is.
Because obviously somebody who thinks that they read the Vinny or whatever, they kind of have an idea, and then they go to a place and they're like, they're having cheese and what's all this stuff, and so it's a good question to answer.
Okay, and Kumo says, is coconut water a good option? Generally speaking, coconut water is considered to be fruit juice. Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with coconut water in the evening. Yeah, it seems to be fruit juice. And Jim says, so could monastics have bone broth? I think so. I think that would fit under the allowance for meat broth. Yeah. And says, would say meat stock dissolved in water like a tea be allowable? Yeah, again, if it's just the liquid, so just the bone broth or meat broth liquid, then yeah, that would seem to be allowable. Yeah. Yeah. Don't see a problem there. Yeah, so actually for a while when I was, I think about 3 vasa, for a while there, the abbot was having me drink chicken broth every day. Because he had formed the idea that it was going to be supportive to my health. I don't know if it was or wasn't, but it was nice to have chicken broth every day. It was in Canada. It was freezing cold. So a nice hot thermos of chicken broth was actually quite nice. And he was of the belief that it supported my health, and maybe he was right. And that's the last of the questions from online. Anything from in person here? No? Anything? No? Okay, well, maybe we can go ahead and end the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.